And color is really tricky to hit. I mean, you really have to understand your malting process in order to make a Pilsner malt, right? Very light color, to a Vienna, to a Munich, um, and once you get beyond those Munich, those amberish colored malts, you switch over into a roaster, right? So that's the second part we can talk about once we've talked about malting, um, and yeah, and so it's it takes understanding your equipment and the ingredients you work with.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a perfect segue because one of the benefits, reading and doing some research on your site of Epiphany is that you talk about how you don't do the floor steeping as opposed to you have a kiln box. So can you talk a little bit about what the differences are, in my very short amount of research? I saw some pictures of, it looked like somebody's basement and a bunch of grain scattered out and just water sitting there and it's just steeping in the floor, which I'm
Right.
sure is a sanitary process. I'm sure that's just like standard procedure. But on the flip side, you check out your website and you've got what's called a kiln box, and saying how that's allows you to do different things with the malt. Can you tell us, like, what are the benefits of using that as opposed to the floor steeping?
Yeah, sure. So there's two different ways uh, of sort of making malt. There's really the traditional way you just talked about, this floor malting, right, where it's spread out over a smaller floor for craft brewers, or these sort of giant warehouses for the still commercial floor maltsters, mostly in England, who still do that. And and so that's basically the process how humanity has done it for the last whatever 8,000 years, when sort of making alcohol from grain was discovered by accident. So the assumption is that somebody left grain out, it got wet, it sprouted, right? It's created these sugars, yeast got in, it fermented, and then somebody drank it and was exhilarated, and it's like, hey, we got to do this more often, right? That's sort of the short story. And so this traditional floor malting is essentially still that, right? You have grain, you bring it out on the floor, you water it down, with watering technique, whatever you have, right? Buckets or a hose or whatever, very simple. And you basically just do like you would do gardening in some sense. And what it creates is a floor, and the germination that then sets in creates a heat and CO2, right? It's a active metabolism like many others. And so if you would look at it through a heat sensor, you would see like a shaggy rug in terms of heat. There's hotter spots and cooler spots across that floor. And so people have all these techniques with raking and flipping it over to kind of even out the grain over the 4 or 5 days it germinates. But these floor malts end up having a sort of unique character and of slightly over and under modified grains because of all these variations that you have. So Mare's Otter is the typical malt out of England that's floor malted still. At Warminster, for example, they do that, and on a large scale. And so that's what a lot of homebrewers certainly still get when they buy English grain, and commercial brewers sometimes still do the same thing. And so it is a somewhat more uncontrolled traditional malting, right? And so what we are doing here is, and that was sort of part of the concept of starting Epiphany. As a brewer, right, who's brewed for many years at various size breweries, getting excellent malt was key, right? And being able to produce something that I would want to brew with. And so looking for this type of equipment was 5, 6, 7 years ago a real challenge, because craft malt hadn't really taken off. There was a handful, but very, very hands-on, the traditional style. And so the boxes that we have essentially are modern malting, and it's all done by forced air. So the way the box works is you fill it up and it has a floor in it, and the floor is similar to a lauter tun, is perforated. And so the grain sits on top of that floor, 3-4 feet up. And the way you control temperature and humidity is you send air through that floor, and it comes up through, goes through the grain, and basically evens out the temperature across the entire box in this case, right? And so the 20,000 pounds we have in one of these boxes, all the kernels have essentially the same temperature with a little variation from bottom to top, and the same humidity according to how we set it. And so we end up with a very even, homogeneous batch character because of that level of control, and it makes for a very even flavor and colored malt.
Very nice.
So you said it sits on like a perforated floor. So is it still steeping in water? Is it still in water, or is it just the humidity that allows it to sprout?
So the first 2 days is when you get it wet, and so you do steeping in a steep tank. So it really looks like a fermenter. And if you go on my website, there's a picture of the top of the tank, and there's sort of water and air floating around in one of the clips, and that's our steep tank. And so while the grain is being steeped, we pump in a lot of air, and so it's really like a heavy whirlpool experience for this grain, because the grain in the end doesn't like to be underwater and suffocate, and so this water air mixture is the perfect. It's like rain, right? It gets wet, but it has air access, and so that's really important. The first steeping and how the grain gets off the ground determines how well it goes for the next 7 days, and so having control over that is really important.